I used to think the end of a career would arrive like an old friend at dusk, quiet on the porch, hat in hand, respectful of the years we'd shared. Instead, it came under fluorescent cafeteria lights that hummed like tired bees, with a sheet cake sweating in its plastic dome, and a half-deflated balloon snagged in a ceiling vent, as if even helium had decided to call it a day. They called it a retirement party, but it felt more like a layover in a town where the train no longer stops. I had been at Harridan Industrial for 42 years, long enough to remember when the building still smelled faintly of hot oil and new steel, when the machines needed listening to instead of logging into, when we trusted wrenches more than dashboards. I hired in as a millwright's apprentice, learned the shapes of problem and solution by touch, and by the time most of my hair had turned the color of winter, I was the man they called before dawn, when a line jammed and the whole day hinged on one stubborn cog. I thought those things counted. Maybe they still do, but you wouldn't have known it that afternoon. There was a folding table dressed in a tablecloth, thin as an apology, a stack of plates someone forgot to unsticker, and a row of paper cups that stuck together the way people don't. Around me, the new guard clustered, shirts shiny with confidence, shoes that had never seen a factory floor, voices pitched just a little too loud to be natural. They had job titles that sounded like apps: synergy architect, innovation lead, something called a culture evangelist that made me think of tent revivals and quarterly goals. Their laughter rang off the tile like a fork dropped in a sink. "Walter!" A hand landed on my shoulder, light and friendly the way a salesman's hand is. It belonged to Trent Mallory, vice president of operations at 34, jawline sharp enough to open packages. He had come up fast, the sort of ascent that leaves no time to notice who's still on the ladder below. He wore a watch you could have traded it for my first pickup, and a smile tuned to the frequency of cameras. "Say a few words for the team, won't you?" A little wisdom for the road. I looked around at the crowd. Old friends from the floor who'd tucked in along the back wall, like pew-sitters at a funeral. And the new breed up front, phones ready, not for me, but for the performance. I cleared my throat and felt the place where nerves and memory live rub against each other. "I don't have much wisdom you can tweet," I said, hands folded in front of me because Margaret, my late wife, had always said a man should know what to do with his hands when eyes are on him. "But I can tell you this. Machines will tell you the truth if you listen, and people will too if you're brave enough to hear it. Keep your word fresh, your tools sharp, and your temper on a shorter leash than your patience." A few of the old-timers nodded. Someone by the vending machine said, "Here, here," in a voice that sounded like coffee at 4 a.m. The younger faces shifted, polite smiles hovering like screensavers. Trent clapped, 3 precise pats that made no sound at all. "Classic Walter," he said, grinning at the interns as if we'd just shared a joke they might one day understand. "Now, cake!" The plastic lid sighed as he lifted it. The frosting read, "Happy retirement, Walter. Enjoy obsolescence." A pause bloomed where silence turns into understanding. Someone snorted. Someone else said, "Whoops," in a way that meant not whoops at all. It was supposed to say, "Enjoy the next chapter," a junior HR associate murmured, cheeks blotching. But the laughter had already found a seam. It trickled from the front row, 3 guys from Ops who wore envy like cologne, and then it spread across the glossy smiles of the people who believed the world was a runway built just for them. I felt heat rise into my face, that old familiar climbing flush that starts in your chest and works north. 42 years and I had been turned into a punchline by a piping bag. Trent leaned toward the cake with theatrical concern, then looked up, bright as a stage light. "It's just a joke, folks. We all know we can't be analog forever." He winked at me, a friendly bullet. "No offense, Walter. You're a legend of the old school." There it was. Legend, like a plaque on a wall no one reads. Old school, like a faded photograph hung crooked in a hallway they're about to redecorate. I smiled because a man learns to. It's what keeps the peace at Thanksgiving and on loading docks. But inside, something steady took a step backward and planted its feet. They served cake with plastic forks that bent if you asked them for anything more than acquiescence. A young analyst in a blazer the color of wet asphalt sidled up to me. Phone already open to a calendar invite. "We're rolling out a predictive maintenance platform," he said as if it were a newborn son. "Machine learning, neural nets, the works. No more listen to the spindle. The model hears things you can't." "Be careful what you teach it to hear," I said. "Sometimes the noise you feed a thing becomes the truth it spits back." He blinked as if I'd spoken in a language that didn't offer stock options. "Right," he said, and turned to congratulate someone on an ideation sprint. In the back, Gloria from procurement, who'd slipped me cough drops during a winter cold in '03 and scolded me for not wearing a scarf, caught my eye and winced, her mouth making a small sorry. Hector from shipping lifted his cup like a salute. The world hadn't tilted entirely. It had simply shifted its weight until certain people slid toward the edges. Trent called for attention, raising his glass. Sparkling water, because image. "To a man who showed us how it used to be done," he said, smile gleaming, "and to the future, where we'll do it better. There is a skill to humiliation done in public. No shouting, no slurs, nothing you can put on a form. Only a bright room and a handsome boy, and a sentence that rearranges a life's work into a before and after." I took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold and tasted like resignation. When the clapping finally dried up, I shook hands, signed a card that had been pre-printed with best wishes and names from people who didn't know mine, and carried my small box of desk things, photos, a pocket level, the brass calipers Margaret gave me for our 10th anniversary, down the hallway that had held my footsteps for half my life. The walls wore motivational posters like borrowed jackets. "Disrupt or die, faster is kinder. Legends never retire, they relaunch." I paused at the last one, then kept walking. At the glass doors, the receptionist called out, "Congratulations!" in the bright tone of a weather report. Outside, the wind off the river smelled like metal and rain. I put the box in the passenger seat, buckled it in because you shouldn't let what's breakable slide, and sat for a minute with my hands on the wheel, the kind of silence in my chest that makes you listen for the old motors idle. A notification pinged on my phone, an all-hands memo from Trent, already live. Subject, "Farewell to a legend," and a look ahead. Team, today we celebrate Walter Grayson as he begins his next chapter. His contributions are part of our history, even as we embrace a future defined by innovation and agility. Let's honor the past by inventing what's next. History, the softest kind of erasure. I drove home by the long way, down River Street, where the brick warehouses have been turned into something called live workspaces, past St. Bridget's, where Margaret and I used to slip into the back pew when grief had made our living room too loud. The house welcomed me the way houses do when you've taught them how. The porch light I always leave on until the first coffee is poured, the screen door that has learned not to squeal. Inside, the afternoon made a ladder of light across the rug. I set the box on the dining table and lifted the lid, like a man disarming something small and personal. The calipers lay where I'd placed them, cool against my palm. I closed my eyes and remembered Margaret's laugh when I'd opened the velvet case all those years ago. "Every man needs a way to measure what matters," she'd said, pressing her cheek into the crook of my neck, and I'd told her she was right and meant the kind of right that lasts. On the mantel, a photograph we took in '89 held us at the fair. She's in a red scarf. I have a mustache I pretend not to remember, and we're both younger than the children we never had time to raise. I spoke to her the way widowers do when the house is safely empty. "They called me a legend," I said, and heard the way the word didn't fit my mouth. "They called me obsolete, too, only they spelled it in frosting. No answer came unless you count the tick of the hallway clock, and the way light moved across the frame like a benediction. I don't believe the dead speak back, but I do believe we keep our bargains with them. I made tea because coffee felt too much like the office. I sat with the steam on my face and let the day pass through me until only the hard kernel of it remained. The insult wasn't fatal. The knife had not cut deep enough to strike anything vital, but it had found a rib. I could feel the bruise forming already, a dark bloom under the skin. I took the box into the den and began the ritual of sorting a life into piles. Keep, give, let go. Old blueprints, ticket stubs from ball games, a key to a toolbox that no longer exists. At the very bottom, under a coil of drafting tape and a set of hex keys that had traveled with me through 3 shops, a thick manila envelope rested with the patient weight of something that expects to be found. My name, W. Grayson, was handwritten in my script, the tidy block letters the Navy taught me not to lose. I slid out the contents onto the desk, a stack of yellowing contracts, correspondence with a law firm that has since turned its name into initials, and sealed inside a plastic sleeve, a United States patent certificate issued 26 years ago, the embossed seal catching the late sun. Below the seal, the title I hadn't thought about in a decade and a half, the method we'd developed in the old line when a supplier went belly up, and we had a month to either pivot or perish. I remembered the nights we worked with thermoses and stubbornness, the morning the prototype finally sang, the agreement the company signed because money was tight, and they needed speed more than they needed ownership. Licensing arrangement, the lawyer had called it, a phrase that sounded like a handshake with teeth. The term was long, the renewal clauses were longer, and my signature was everywhere. I read, and as I read, the bruise in my ribs cooled into something else, something like clarity. The process wasn't just a story we told in the break room. It was still the artery in the new smart line, beneath all the dashboards and dashboards about dashboards. Trent's memos proudly trumpeted our proprietary method in every quarterly deck. Proprietary, yes, but not theirs. I set the certificate down carefully, as if it might startle and run. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once and then thought better of it. The kettle clicked off in the kitchen, and I realized I was smiling. Not wide, not young, but the kind of smile a man wears when puzzle pieces decide to sit where they belong, and the picture on the box finally makes sense. They had thrown a party to tell me I belonged to the past. The past had just walked into my dining room wearing a gold seal and my name. "I hear you," I said to the photograph on the mantel, ridiculous and sincere at once. "Measure what matters." The insult of the afternoon slid into place like a final shim. It had not wounded me so much as woken me, and there is a difference. Tomorrow could take care of itself, but I knew what it would contain. A call to Henry Lowell, an old friend who had left the grind to practice law, with the kind of care that made judges lean forward. A visit to a safe deposit box to pull the duplicates I had nearly forgotten. A quiet appointment with myself to read every clause twice and the renewals 3 times, and a walk past the river where the wind teaches you the virtue of patience. By the time the porch light clicked on of its own accord, I had put the envelope back together and stacked it on the desk, not like a relic, but like a tool. The house settled, satisfied. I washed a single cup and left it to dry on the rack. Wiped the table with the square of cloth Margaret had favored because it left no lint, and turned off the lamp in the den. In the hallway mirror, a man looked back at me who was not obsolete and not done. He was, if anything, precisely on time. I slept like a man who had put his hand on the right lever at last, and when morning came, a clean slice of light across the floor, the smell of rain promised but not yet delivered. I shaved, tied the plain blue tie Margaret said made me look honest, and went to find the rest of my name in the fine print. Because if there is one gift left for a man my age, it is this: to be underestimated by people who have never had to fix a thing they themselves broke. When I woke the next morning, the taste of that retirement cake still lingered. though I had barely eaten more than a forkful. It wasn't sugar or frosting I carried with me into daylight. It was the word they had carved into its surface like a wound. Obsolescence. A word meant for machines, not men. And yet, there it was, printed in cheerful blue icing for everyone to laugh at, while I held a paper plate and tried not to flinch. The house was quiet, as it always is when you live alone. Margaret's absence filled every corner in ways sound never could. The kettle whistled, the clock ticked, and outside the sparrows fussed at the feeder I kept filled, because she would have wanted me to. I sat at the table with my coffee cooling in my hand, staring at the brass calipers she had given me years ago. They caught the morning light, the metal still bright, despite decades of use. Margaret had always said, "Measure what matters." Yesterday they had measured my worth in frosting letters and declared it gone. I thought back over the years I had given Harridan industrial. The early mornings when the river fog still clung to the loading docks. The nights I stayed past midnight, listening to a grinding spindle no one else could hear, coaxing it back to life because a whole shift of men were waiting to work. I remembered training kids barely out of high school, teaching them the hum of a healthy motor, the feel of a good bearing in your palm. Many of those boys had gone on to bigger things. Some of them still sent Christmas cards. I had been proud of that, proud to be part of something larger than myself. But pride felt different now. Pride had been turned into a punchline by a group of men who thought progress meant erasing the past. I went to the mantel where Margaret's picture sat. Her eyes caught mid-laugh at some forgotten joke, scarf wrapped around her neck against a long-ago autumn chill. "Did you hear them?" I asked softly. My voice didn't shake, but the air felt heavier for it. "They called me a legend? Then they called me finished." You'd have smiled, said it was only words. But you would have seen the knife, too. Talking to her had become habit in these years since the cancer took her. Some might call it foolish, but I found a kind of balance in it, as though her silence steadied the parts of me that wanted to break. She had always known how to take the sting from an insult, how to remind me that dignity wasn't what others gave you. It was what you refused to surrender. Still, the hurt was sharp. It was more than a clumsy cake or Trent Mallory's smug grin. It was the insult of a life's work reduced to a slogan, the insult of being told that 4 decades of sweat and sacrifice could be swept aside by an app and a buzzword. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, and in doing so they had awakened something I hadn't felt in years, the steady pulse of anger, tempered by experience, sharpened into resolve. I walked into the den where boxes of old paperwork sat waiting to be sorted. Retirement meant cleaning out, putting things in order. I had been putting it off, but now I felt drawn to it, as though the past might offer me more than nostalgia. Papers rustled under my hands, maintenance logs, blueprints, manuals annotated in my own hand. And beneath it all, the manila envelope with my name in block letters. I had seen it yesterday, but now, after a restless night, it seemed to glow faintly with promise. I lifted the envelope, heavier than memory alone, and felt the weight of ink and signatures. Margaret used to tease me for saving everything, for filing away every agreement and receipt. "One day," she'd said, "all that paper will either bury you or save you." Sitting at the desk, I spread the documents out before me. Contracts, correspondence, the patent certificate, its embossed seal still crisp. I traced the lettering with my finger, remembering the pride of that day when our little breakthrough had been made official. We had signed the licensing arrangement in desperation, the company needing speed. Me too tired to haggle. But the terms had been generous to me in a way I had almost forgotten. Outside, the church bell marked the hour. I realized I had been staring at the paper for nearly half an hour, lost in memory and possibility. Yesterday, humiliation had burned me hollow. Today, I felt the first spark of something else, an ember of defiance glowing steady beneath the ash. I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under my weight, and allowed myself a small smile. They had called me obsolete. They had declared my value spent. But sitting here, with Margaret's calipers catching the sun and the patent papers spread before me, I realized something simple. They didn't know what I still held. I closed the envelope carefully, as though it were a secret that needed guarding. My reflection in the darkened glass of the window looked back at me, not broken, not finished, just waiting. "They'll learn, Margaret," I murmured. "They'll learn what useless looks like when it stares back from a mirror, and it won't be me." Paper has a smell when it has waited long enough. Dust and linen and a faint whisper of ink that has married the fibers for good. When I slid the manila envelope across the desk and spilled its contents into the late morning light, that old smell rose up like a memory you didn't invite but are glad to see. Margaret would have teased me for the care with which I laid each sheet out in tidy rows, but she would have approved of the care itself. "Measure what matters," she would have said, and I could feel the caliper's cool weight where I had set them to hold a corner flat. The patent certificate sat in the center, dignified as a framed diploma. 26 years since the seal was pressed, my name spelled cleanly, the title as dry and exact as the work that had built it. Around it, the contracts, a licensing agreement on our shop's letterhead back when the logo still had a gear in it, riders and renewals like the rings on a tree, each dated, initialed, and witnessed by men who have since retired or died. A correspondence trail with a Boston law firm that believed in stamping everything twice. I ran a finger along the first agreement and read in the way a man listens for a motor's hidden chatter. Not the words, but the space between them. We'd written it in a hurry back when our supplier went under and the line was starving for a part nobody made anymore. I'd cobbled together an answer, part ingenuity, part luck, part stubborn refusal to let good men clock out empty-handed. The company had been grateful in the way companies are when the doors need to stay open, generously in the moment, strategically on paper. They took a license to use and practice the Grayson process. That phrase still made me sit a little taller. At the River Works facility for the production of components A through D. What they did not take was ownership. The patent remained mine. They could use it in that place, for those things, while they paid a modest royalty that everyone swore would barely be felt and would be made regular by the accountants who lived 2 floors above the shop and wore ties even on Fridays. I turned the page. There it was, the thing I remembered without quite remembering. Audit rights, I could, on written. Notice, examine their books once a year to verify the count of covered units. If the discrepancies ran above 5%, they'd cover the audit and a penalty. At the time, I hadn't imagined needing to chase numbers. We were building parts and paying mortgages and pretending the future could be domesticated. But the past is a better lawyer than hope. Whoever drafted that clause had tucked a small blade inside the handle of the knife. I kept reading. 7 years later, a renewal, same terms extended to include retrofit of the North Line within Riverworks, still site-specific, still limited to the same list of components. Another renewal after that, with a short, careful letter from me on top, the letter that gave this chapter its name, typed on my little home machine, signed in the even hand I have carried since the Navy, mailed certified, the green card stapled to the back, with a date and a stamp, and the soft proof of things done properly. Pursuant to Section 3.2, I hereby exercise the right to renew the license for a further term. Henry Lowell, then at Dyer and Banks, had scribbled a note at the bottom in his tidy lawyer's hand. Good. Keep the receipt with the file. Glad you insisted on site specificity. Site specificity. I tapped the phrase with the end of my pen 3 times, a habit I didn't know I had until I did it. The contract said Riverworks, not Westline. Not the new Harridan Smart Fab they kept showing in glossy videos at the all-hands, with Trent striding between glassed-in bays while adjectives followed him like obedient dogs. Riverworks, 1 plant, 1 license, royalties tied to units made there. Any other use required a separate agreement. I slid my chair back and reached for the last few years' annual reports from the bookcase. Free copies they used to mail me out of courtesy, then out of inertia. The newer ones bragged about process harmonization across facilities, about leveraging proprietary methods in all geographies, about enterprise-wide scaling of legacy innovations. Legacy innovations. You could hear the smirk in the copywriter's teeth. The diagrams were worse, a tidy flowchart, my method nestled at the heart of 3 different plants, the same little icon repeating like a dare. I didn't need their bragging to prove what my bones already knew, but it helped to see my suspicions set in blue ink. The license we'd signed for one place had been treated as if it were a passport for the company's whole new world. The kettle clicked itself off in the kitchen. I let the steam kiss my knuckles and brought the mug back to the desk. On the first agreement, a paragraph had been highlighted once. Faint now, but legible. Field of use. There it was, the list of parts, letters A through D. At the bottom of the flowchart in their report, labeled neat as a teacher's gradebook. Product E, ramping to full capacity. Q3. I had never seen my process applied to E. It hadn't existed when we drafted this. Somebody had decided the alphabet could be bullied into compliance. I pulled a yellow legal pad toward me, the same brand I'd favored since '98, and made 2 columns. On the left, what they may do. On the right, what they are doing. The left column filled itself with nouns pulled directly from the contract, the right with phrases from their own proud boasts. Every time the lines failed to match, I drew a line between them as if I were wiring a circuit. It looked by the end like the kind of diagram that tells you something will smoke if you flip the wrong switch. Under the pad, in a thin folder I had nearly missed, I found a set of checks, royalty payments, small but steady, through the years. They had been regular until 4 summers ago when they began to stutter, then shrink, then true up with a note about temporary accounting system, migration impacts, an apology as believable as a street magician's coin. 2 of the last 4 quarters were missing entirely. Either their bookkeeper had developed a unique form of amnesia, or someone had decided the retired man on the south side wasn't reading his mail. I picked up the certified mail receipt again, thumbed its ridged edge, and thought of Trent raising his glass, while a room decided it could laugh at a man who had built the table they were leaning on. That laugh had put me in this chair. That laugh had led me to this receipt. If I had any kindness in me for their arrogance, it evaporated under the slow warmth of the tea. A glint from the desk's shallow drawer caught my eye. The brass key to my safe deposit box at the bank, still tied to the little blue tag Margaret had labeled, in pencil. WG and duplicates. I turned it in my fingers, felt the familiar notch that aligned with a lock I hadn't seen in years, and allowed myself a quiet, private nod. The copies weren't necessary, not yet, but a careful man confirms what he already believes. There were originals at the bank, stamped and sealed, and a letter from Henry on his old firm's stationery, advising me to keep them there. I would go tomorrow. The act of turning that small key would anchor this from memory to fact. I took a fresh page and began a list titled Questions for Henry. Not angry questions, not theatrical, just the kind that keep a man from tripping over his own feet when the stakes rise. Scope of audit right across multi-site use, injunction likelihood if infringement proven, damages, unpaid royalties plus penalty plus multiplier, negotiation leverage versus litigation timeline. Practical things, the kind of things Margaret would have called the bones of a plan. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, the sound of its brakes familiar enough to be comforting. I sat back, let the chair groan in the way old wood does when it remembers the shape of you, and looked at the spread of papers, the gentle slope of the legal pad, the tidy night-blooming flower of a plan that had been there all along, just waiting for light. I wasn't angry in the hot, ruinous way that sets men to shouting. I was angry in the way steel is, tempered, quiet, given over to purpose. Before dusk, I gathered everything into fresh sleeves, labeled them with my old engineer's fussiness: patent, original, license, renewals, royalties, gaps, corp reports, admissions, and set them in a crisp stack that made a satisfying weight under my palm. I called the bank and asked for time on the box in the morning. I pulled Henry's card from the back of the drawer, the new one with his solo practice address and the phone number he answers himself, and placed it on top of the pile where I couldn't pretend not to see it. "Tomorrow," I told Margaret's photograph, not for drama, but as a statement of schedule. "Tomorrow we stop letting other people name the value of our work." In the kitchen, the last of the day slanted across the sink. I washed my cup, dried it with the lintless cloth she'd favored, and put it back in its place. The house settled with the pleasure of a task chosen and begun. I turned out the light in the den and stood for a moment at the doorway, looking at the stack on the desk. Ordinary papers that had discovered their own gravity. They had called me obsolete. The drawer had called me by my proper name. The morning broke clear, the kind of spring day when even the river seems to hold its breath. I shaved, put on a clean shirt, and slipped the brass safe deposit key into my pocket, its weight reminding me of both memory and obligation. At the bank, the clerk led me into the vault with the same formality she might show any customer, unaware of how much of my life was packed into that narrow steel drawer. When I slid it open and saw the duplicate contracts and certified letters, I felt something steady rise in me. Memory had not lied. Paper had kept its oath. From there I drove across town to an office that looked more like a converted farmhouse than a law practice. Henry Lowell had never liked glass towers. He said they made lawyers forget they were supposed to serve people, not corporations. He had a brass plaque by the door and a secretary who still answered the phone instead of letting machines do the talking. When I walked in, Henry rose from behind his desk, a tall man gone silver at the temples, his handshake still firm. "Walter," he said warmly, "when you called, I thought you were inviting me for fishing. But I see by that folder you've brought me trouble instead." "Not trouble," I said, setting the papers down between us. "Opportunity, though trouble may be its twin." We spent the better part of 2 hours going line by line through the contracts. Henry adjusted his glasses, tapped margins with his fountain pen, and grunted in the way a craftsman does when he finds a joint well made. "You were smart to insist on site specificity," he said at one point. "River works only, and you, renewed properly, on time, in writing. They're bound." "And if they've been using it everywhere else?" I asked quietly, though I already knew the answer. He smiled, a lawyer's smile, but also a friend's. "Then they've been eating fruit from a tree they didn't plant. That's infringement, Walter. Plain as day. You could seek damages for unpaid royalties, maybe even injunctions to stop production until they pay or settle. Do you realize the leverage you have?" Leverage. It wasn't a word I had used much in my years on the floor, but I understood it all the same. Leverage is how you move what's heavier than you. Henry leaned back, folding his hands. "The question is, what do you want? Money? A settlement? Or something else?" I thought of Trent Mallory's grin, the way he had raised his glass over that cake like he was christening my irrelevance. Money would buy comfort, sure, but respect, that was the currency I hadn't been paid in. "I don't want charity," I said slowly. "I want them to remember who built their foundation, and I want them to know a man they called obsolete still holds the key to their present." Henry chuckled. "That sounds like a man who isn't finished after all." He grew serious again. "We'll start with a letter, a firm one. Demand they account for every use of your process outside Riverworks, and every product beyond the scope. We'll give them 30 days. If they don't comply, we move to court. But mark my words, once they see you're serious, they'll want to negotiate." I nodded. The spark inside me was no longer just a flicker. It felt like a coal beginning to glow. When I left Henry's office, the sun was higher, and the world seemed sharper. Cars passed, children shouted on a playground across the street, and for the first time in weeks, I walked with my shoulders back. I wasn't just a retired man anymore. I was a man with a plan, with rights inked in law, and a friend who knew how to wield them. That evening, back at the house, I sat at the desk and reread Margaret's Caliper's inscription, "Measure what matters." For years I had measured bolts, bearings, tolerances. Now I was measuring respect, dignity, and the weight of silence turned into action. I wrote in my notebook, Step 1, Henry drafts demand letter. Step 2, bank confirms originals secure. Step 3, prepare for their denial. The page looked neat, almost ordinary, but to me it felt like a battle map, not a war of noise, but of patience. And patience, I knew, was a tool they had forgotten I possessed. Before bed, I stood at the window and looked out at the maple saplings in the yard. Their branches were thin, but they were rooted, unbending to the breeze. I whispered into the quiet, they thought they buried me. But maybe I was only planted. The night held the words without judgment. Somewhere I could almost hear Margaret's laughter in reply. The letter went out on Henry's. Stationery, heavy paper, embossed seal, words precise as chisels. We demand full accounting of the use and scope of the Grayson process outside the licensed facility. It was the kind of language that left no room for laughter. When I read the draft before it was mailed, I didn't change a thing. I only signed at the bottom, initials neat as the day I learned them. Then began the waiting. 30 days, Henry had said. 30 days for them to scramble, deny, or negotiate. 30 days in which I could prepare for whatever storm they chose to send back. I filled those days carefully, as a man sharpens his tools before winter. First, I pulled every annual report, every shareholder letter, every glossy magazine article they'd published about their innovations. I circled phrases, clipped diagrams, and stacked them in folders labeled with Margaret's neat old system. Blue for financials, red for technical, yellow for press. They had been proud, far too proud, of parading my process under banners they had no right to wave. Pride leaves footprints, and I intended to follow everyone. Second, I began making calls. Not loud calls, not announcements, just quiet conversations with people who still remembered me as more than a name on a cake. Old shop supervisors who had retired to Florida, a procurement man now consulting in Denver, even an engineer who had jumped ship to a competitor years ago. Each gave me a piece of the puzzle, when the process had expanded, how it had been sold to clients, where the lines had blurred. I thanked them all, careful not to overreach, careful to let them think it was just curiosity. But in my notebook, the puzzle was forming into a picture that any jury could see. At night, I wrote in Margaret's journal, not the one she left me, but the one I had started after she passed. It was half diary, half ledger of promises kept. May 12th. Henry says patience. They will scoff, but paper holds. I will not go to them in anger. I will go to them in order. Writing steadied me, kept the anger from burning too hot. Anger is like a torch. It lights the way, but if you hold it too close, it scorches your own hand. One evening, Linda from across the street stopped by with soup. She asked gently how retirement was treating me. I smiled, told her I was keeping busy, and we sat on the porch while the sun dropped behind the maples. I didn't tell her about patents or lawsuits. I only said, sometimes people forget what you've built until you remind them. She nodded, as though she knew more than I had spoken, and left the soup with instructions to warm it properly. In those quiet days, I also reached out to an old union contact. He owed me nothing, but he remembered the winter strike I'd helped mediate without letting tempers ruin families. "Walter," he said on the phone, voice rough with age, "men still talk about that. You were fair. Call if you need a whisper carried." I thanked him, hung up, and felt the weight of something stronger than money, respect banked over years, now ready to draw on. Every night, I returned to the envelope. I read the clauses until I knew them by heart. Site specificity, field of use, audit rights. They had become more familiar than the prayers I once said as a boy. Each clause was a nail in a structure they had ignored, but which still stood firm, waiting for me to point to it. By the third week, I sensed movement. An article in the trade press mentioned Harridan facing questions over intellectual property. A former colleague emailed me, cautiously, to ask if it was true I was pursuing something. Gossip moves fast in industries built on trust, and I let it. I didn't confirm, I didn't deny. I only wrote back, old agreements sometimes still matter. At night, when the waiting felt longest, I reminded myself what Margaret used to say when we played cards. The quiet hand is the dangerous one. So I kept quiet. I sharpened my evidence, folded my patience, and stacked my allies like lumber. They thought I had been buried under a word. Obsolete. What they hadn't seen was the slow, steady growth of roots beneath their feet. By the end of the month, when Henry called and said, "We have their reply," I was ready, not with fury, but with order. Henry's voice over the phone was calm, but I could hear the small edge of satisfaction behind it. "They replied, Walter, dismissive, as expected. They claim your process is fully theirs now, absorbed into corporate practice. They called your demand an unfortunate misunderstanding by a retired employee." I sat at the kitchen table, fingers resting on Margaret's calipers. The words landed without surprise, but not without heat. Retired employee. They had reduced 42 years to 2 words, as if my life's work were an old uniform folded and tossed in a drawer. "Henry," I said slowly, "how strong is our hand?" He chuckled. "Strong enough to knock the table over. They've admitted in writing that they treat the process as their own, while the contract and patent prove otherwise. It's arrogance disguised as confidence. That arrogance will cost them." I closed my eyes, letting the weight of it sink in. Then we moved forward. Within a week, Henry filed a notice of intent to audit their books, citing clause and subsection in bold type. He attached certified copies of the contracts, renewals, and royalty checks that had mysteriously stopped. A demand for immediate payment of arrears accompanied it, with penalties and interest spelled out like an invoice carved in stone. The response from Harridan was swift, but sloppy. A junior lawyer called Henry's office, insisting that innovation cycles had made the process unrecognizable, that Walter Grayson's contribution had been immaterial. Henry let the young man talk himself hoarse before replying, "We'll see if a judge agrees. Discovery will be educational." Meanwhile, the whispers grew louder. A trade publication ran a headline, "Legacy Engineer Challenges Harridan Industrial Over Process Rights." It wasn't front-page news yet, but it was enough to make employees gossip in the cafeteria. Gloria from procurement called me one evening, her voice tight with both loyalty and fear. "Walter, the execs are furious. They said your claims are a nuisance, but the line managers, they're whispering that you're right. They've seen the flow charts. They know. Tell them to keep their heads down," I said gently. "This isn't their fight, not yet." But in my heart, I felt the tide beginning to turn. 2 weeks later, I was invited, no, summoned, to meet with the board, not by Trent Mallory, not by HR, but by the chairman himself, a man who had once shaken my hand in a factory tour decades ago and forgotten me soon after. The letter was polished. "We'd like to resolve this amicably." Henry smiled when he read it. "Amicable means they're worried. They'll try to buy you off." He was right. The boardroom looked different from the shop floor, but it smelled faintly of fear. Men in suits, women with tablets, lawyers with folders lined up like shields. Trent was there, of course, wearing that same smug grin that had poisoned my retirement cake. He didn't grin for long. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Grayson, we respect your service to Harridan, truly, but this claim is disruptive. We'd like to offer you a settlement, a generous one." A number was slid across the table. 6 figures, tidy and tempting. I let the silence stretch. the way Margaret used to let a point hang in the air before answering. Then I pushed the paper back. "Gentlemen," I said quietly, "I'm not here for charity. I'm here for respect. You took what wasn't yours and called me obsolete. Respect isn't bought, it's owed." Trent scoffed, his voice cutting in. "Respect? With all due respect, Walter, this is business. You're clinging to the past." I turned to him, steady as a stone. "The past is what built the chair you're sitting in, and the paper that lets me pull it out from under you." For the first time, his smile faltered. The chairman leaned forward. "If you won't take the offer, what do you want?" I folded my hands. "An accounting, payment of every royalty you've withheld, and recognition, written in public, that the Grayson process is mine. Refuse, and we'll let the courts remind you." The room stiffened, lawyers scribbled, eyes darted. The meeting ended with no handshake, only the weight of silence. As I left, I caught sight of Trent's reflection in the glass wall, jaw tight, knuckles white around his folder. The kind of man who knows the ground is shifting, but refuses to admit it. Outside, the sun was warm, and the river glinted like steel. I walked slowly, savoring the air. This was no longer about humiliation at a cake table. This was about a lifetime measured properly, at last. At home that night, I wrote in the journal, June 2nd. They offered me money, as if dignity had a price tag. I refused. Respect is not sold, it is earned. Tomorrow will be harder. Tomorrow will also be mine. The silence after that boardroom meeting didn't last long. Harridan Industrial had thought my refusal would stay behind closed doors, but arrogance leaks. Within a week, whispers turned into paragraphs, and paragraphs into headlines. The first piece came from a regional business journal. Retired engineer claims company using his patented process without license. It was tucked beneath articles about quarterly earnings and mergers, but it had my name in bold. Seeing Walter Grayson in print again, linked not with retirement but with defiance, stirred something in me. For once, I didn't feel like the footnote. By the next week, bigger outlets picked it up. Trade magazines called it a brewing intellectual property dispute. One bold columnist wrote, "It's not every day a man they branded obsolete returns with papers that could cripple their production lines." That sentence alone spread like fire across social media, quoted and shared by people who didn't even know me but liked the shape of the story. Inside the company, the murmurs grew louder. Gloria from procurement called again, her whisper carrying both excitement and fear. "Walter, people are talking in the cafeteria. They say Trent's furious, snapping at managers, calling this a distraction. But others, they're quietly rooting for you. They remember what you did for the River Works line. They know you're right." Hector from shipping left me a voicemail, short and gruff. "Good for you, old man. Been a long time coming." Even strangers began reaching out. An old machinist who'd left Harridan 10 years ago wrote me a letter on lined paper. Shaky handwriting, but steady conviction. They never respected the men who built their machines. Glad to see someone finally making them listen. The support wasn't just moral. A few retired supervisors sent me copies of old memos, diagrams, reports they'd kept out of habit. Each one was another nail in the coffin of Harridan's denial. They thought the past was buried. They forgot old men keep everything. Meanwhile, Henry called me almost daily. "They're rattled," he said one evening. "Their lawyers have started blustering, but bluster means weakness. They know the contract is airtight. The longer this goes public, the more their shareholders will worry." And worry they did. Harridan's stock dipped 3% after the first wave of headlines. It wasn't much, but enough to make analysts ask questions on earnings calls. The executives tried to laugh it off, calling it a legacy matter, but the market has no patience for men who sound uncertain. For me, the days carried a strange mixture of tension and calm. I still woke early, brewed my tea, checked the mail, but now the quiet held a charge, like the air before a storm. I walk by the river in the evenings, letting the water remind me of time's patience. Margaret's photograph waited at home, her eyes steady, her scarf caught in an old autumn wind. I told her what was happening aloud, unashamed. "They're hearing me now," I said, not with shouts, but with the weight of paper and truth. One night, Linda joined me on the porch. She'd read one of the articles. "Walter," she said softly, "you realize you're becoming something bigger than yourself, don't you? You're not just fighting for your name. You're standing for every man who was told his years didn't matter." I didn't answer right away. I just let the words sink in. She was right. What began as an insult carved in icing had become a reckoning much larger than my pride. Toward the end of that week, Henry called with news that tightened the air around me. "They've requested another meeting, not the board this time, the executives themselves. They want to talk before this gets uglier." I smiled into the receiver. "It's already ugly for them, Henry. They just don't realize how much worse it can get." That night, I wrote in my journal, June 14th, "The whispers have turned into voices. The company trembles. They called me obsolete. The world now calls me something else. The man who won't be ignored." I capped my pen, turned off the lamp, and let the house settle into quiet. Outside, the maples swayed in the night breeze, and for the first time since the retirement party, I felt not humiliation but momentum. The ground was shifting, and it was carrying me forward. The letter came by courier this time, thick envelope, heavy stock, logo embossed in silver. Harridan Industrial wanted another meeting. This one, private and constructive. I could smell the polish in the wording, the desperation hidden under courtesy. Henry met me outside the downtown office tower where they'd chosen to hold it, far away from Riverworks, far away from anything that reminded them of grease or steel. He carried his briefcase like a shield. "They'll try to tempt you with more money," he warned. "Bigger number, softer tone, but remember, they're only buying time." I nodded. I didn't need the warning, but I appreciated the steadiness in his voice. The conference room was everything my old shop floor wasn't. Glass walls, chrome fixtures, a long table that looked like it had never known coffee stains. The executives were already waiting, faces arranged into smiles. Too wide to be genuine. Trent Mallory was there too, lounging at the far end, a predator pretending to be patient. The chairman opened with pleasantries. "Mr. Grayson, we're grateful you came. We'd like to settle this matter amicably for everyone's sake." His words were warm, but his eyes kept darting toward the folder Henry had placed on the table. One of the lawyers slid a sheet across the polished wood toward me. I glanced at the number, 7 figures this time, neat as a lottery win. More money than most men dream of in retirement. For a moment, I let myself imagine the things it could buy. A cabin near the lake, a fund for Claire's children, the freedom to never think of Harridan again. But freedom wasn't the point. I pushed the paper back with one finger. "This isn't about money," I said quietly. "It's about respect. You've been using my process without license for years. I don't need a bribe. I need acknowledgement." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Acknowledgement, Mr. Grayson, could complicate shareholder relations. We'd prefer to keep this discreet." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "You called me obsolete in front of a room full of employees. You erased my name from the very thing I created. Discreet is what you lost when you chose arrogance over honesty." Trent finally spoke, his grin sharp. "Come on, Walter. Take the deal. No one cares whose name is on a piece of paper. Legacy isn't worth more than $1 million. I turned to him, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Legacy built the chair you're sitting in, Trent. Legacy keeps the lights on in this building. You think it doesn't matter because you've never built anything that lasted longer than your hairstyle." His grin faltered, a crack in his perfect mask. The chairman raised his hands, trying to soothe the air. "Mr. Grayson, perhaps we can draft language that gives you recognition in a more symbolic way. An honorary plaque, perhaps. We'd even consider a dedication ceremony at Riverworks." I shook my head. A plaque doesn't restore dignity. A plaque doesn't tell the truth. Put it in writing. The Grayson process remains the intellectual property of Walter Grayson, licensed by Harridan Industrial for limited use. That's the only settlement I'll accept. The room fell into silence. Lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Executives exchanged glances. Trent scowled openly now, the boyish charm gone from his face. Finally, the chairman sighed. We'll have to discuss this with the board. Henry closed his briefcase with a snap. Do that. You have 14 days before we file for injunction. Every day you wait, the press grows hungrier. When we left the glass tower, the city air felt cooler, cleaner. I drew a long breath. Henry looked at me sideways. You realize you could have walked away rich today. I don't want to walk away, I said. I want to stand where I belong. That night, I sat on the porch with Margaret's picture in my hand. I told her about the meeting, about the 7-figure check I refused. They think I'm stubborn, I whispered, but you'd know better. You'd call it dignity. The maples swayed in the breeze, and I swore I heard her laughter again, the kind that told me I was exactly where I needed to be. The 14 days they had asked for ticked by like a slow drumbeat. I could almost hear the tension echoing from behind Harridan's glass walls. But I didn't sit idle. Men who survive 40 years in a factory learn that waiting doesn't mean standing still. It means sharpening every tool before the whistle blows. I began with my contacts. Retirement had given me something precious. Time to call the people who mattered. Old engineers, supervisors, men and women who had long since left Harridan, but still carried respect for the work we had done. One by one, I explained just enough, never more than they needed. The company's trying to erase what we built. I mean to remind them. Most responded with quiet loyalty, some with enthusiasm. Walter, one said, if you start something of your own, you'll have clients before the ink dries. And so the idea took root, not just defending what was mine, but building again. I sat at my desk late into the night, sketching outlines like I once sketched schematics. Grayson Consulting, a firm to license my process directly, to advise smaller manufacturers tired of Harridan's arrogance. I didn't need to outgrow them. I only needed to offer a door the industry would be eager to walk through. Henry raised his brows when I told him, You're serious? As serious as the day I signed that first contract, I replied. They called me obsolete. Let's see how obsolete looks when it opens for business. He smiled slowly. Then you'll need investors. Finding them turned out easier than I expected. Word of my fight had spread far beyond what Harridan wanted. An old colleague put me in touch with a mid-sized manufacturer in Ohio. Their VP flew out to meet me in a diner near the river. He leaned over his coffee and said, Walter, if you can offer us the process without Harridan's markup, we'll sign today. We've been gouged for years. I didn't sign anything, not yet, but the promise warmed me. Proof that my leverage was more than theory. Back at home, I dug out a dusty Rolodex from the garage, the one Margaret had insisted I never throw away. She'd been right, as always. Within those cards were numbers for bankers, retired union leaders, even a senator's aide I'd once helped with a local jobs program. Respect, carefully tended over decades, now came back to me like stored harvest. Meanwhile, Harridan grew quieter. No counteroffer arrived, no letter. Only silence thick as oil. That silence told me two things. They were afraid to admit fault, and they were scrambling behind closed doors. In the evenings, Linda stopped by with a casserole or a pie. She'd sit on the porch while I talked through plans, listening more than speaking. You're not just defending yourself anymore, she said one night. You're building something new. That's rarer at your age than revenge. I thought about that long after she left. Maybe she was right. Revenge was fuel, but creation, that was fire that lasted. By the end of those 2 weeks, I had more than gossip. I had commitments. 3 small manufacturers ready to walk away from Harridan if I gave them the option. 2 former supervisors willing to come aboard if I launched my firm. And a quiet nod from the union man. We'll never say it out loud, but if you stand up, we'll make sure word travels. On the 14th day, when Harridan missed their promised reply, Henry called me. They're stalling, he said grimly, which means we file. You ready? I looked around my den, at the folders stacked neatly, at Margaret's calipers gleaming in the lamplight, at the fresh notebook page where I had written, clients committed, 3, allies, growing, future, ours. Yes, I said, I'm ready. That night, I poured a single glass of bourbon and lifted it toward Margaret's photograph. They thought retirement meant silence. They forgot silence is where men like me draw breath. The house held the words, steady as ever. Outside, the maples swayed, their roots deepening quietly in the soil, just as mine were, patient, prepared, unshakable. Henry filed the injunction on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, Harridan's stock had slipped another 5%. By Friday, the whispers in the trade press had turned into headlines, bold enough to make shareholders choke on their coffee. Harridan Industrial faces patent dispute, overcore process. I didn't need to stand in front of their glass tower to feel the tremor. It carried all the way to my porch, where the paperboy's hands shook a little as he delivered the morning edition. Inside, I unfolded the paper slowly, savoring every line. Words I had waited decades to read stared back at me. Grayson process under question. Former engineer retains ownership. Court date imminent. They couldn't bury me anymore. The world had learned my name again. Calls came quickly after that. The first from Ohio, then from Indiana, then even from a manufacturer in Texas I hadn't spoken to in 20 years. Walter, they said, we're ready to walk from Harridan if you'll give us the process direct. I kept my voice steady, my answers measured, but inside I felt the ground tilt in my favor. Respect had a sound. It sounded like options. At Harridan, panic bled into the open. Gloria called late one evening, voice hushed. It's chaos here. Trent's been shouting in meetings. They're threatening to cut jobs to cover losses. But the truth is, Walter, everyone knows it's because of you. They thought you'd take the settlement. Now the floor crews say you're the only one who ever stood up to them. I closed my eyes, listening. That kind of talk spreads faster than fire, and management knew it. They had mocked me at my retirement party, but now they feared me. 2 weeks into the court filing, an analyst on national television tore into Harridan's leadership. How does a multi-billion-dollar company let a retiree hold their supply chain hostage? Either they lied to their shareholders, or they ignored their own contracts. The camera cut to the anchor nodding gravely. Stock tickers ran red across the screen. Harridan lost another 10% that day. Henry called, his voice calm but edged with quiet triumph. Walter, they're bleeding. Every day this stays in the public eye. You gain leverage. They'll come crawling. Don't give them an inch until they sign what you demand. It wasn't just the market. Inside the factory walls, my name was back on people's lips. Hector left me another voicemail. The guys in shipping cheered when they saw the news, Walter. Cheered. Said it's about time somebody reminded them this place was built by hands, not spreadsheets. I walked by the river that evening, the sky painted orange and purple. I thought about Margaret, about the years we had saved and sacrificed, about the insult written in icing that had set all this in motion. It struck me that sometimes humiliation is a seed. You plant it, you water it with patience, and in time it grows into something strong enough to crack the pavement. By the end of the month, 3 contracts had already slipped from Harridan's grasp. Clients signed with me quietly, eager to avoid publicity. Small deals compared to the company's empire, but symbolic, proof that the giant could bleed. On the last day of the quarter, Harridan issued a statement. We are reviewing legacy agreements in good faith. It was corporate language for surrender. I read it aloud on the porch, laughed once, and then wrote in my journal. July 1st, they mocked me with a cake. Now they choke on their own pride. Giants fall when they forget who forged their armor. The fall has begun. I capped the pen, set the journal beside Margaret's photo, and let the silence of the house embrace me. It was the silence of victory in motion, not complete, but inevitable. The maple trees outside rustled in the summer wind. I looked at them and thought, roots matter more than branches. Harridan had forgotten. I had not. The market is a curious beast. It can forgive incompetence, overlook arrogance, even tolerate greed. What it cannot forgive is uncertainty. By mid-July, Harridan Industrial had become a question mark, too large for its shareholders to stomach. Every headline about my case shaved points from its stock price. Every whisper about injunctions made investors twitch. Henry and I sat at his office one humid morning, the blinds drawn against the glare. He had spreadsheets spread across the desk, numbers circled in red. "Walter," he said, tapping the page with his pen, "their shares are down nearly 30% since this began. If you wanted to buy in, this is the moment." I raised my brows. "Buy in?" Henry leaned back, his smile patient. "With the clients already, pledging loyalty to you, with the injunction looming, their stock will keep sliding. But if you quietly purchase a stake now, you'll be positioned for more than a settlement. You'll be positioned for control." The idea sat heavy in the air. I had walked into this fight seeking respect. Ownership had never crossed my mind. Yet as the numbers stared back at me, the thought hardened. If I owned a piece of Harridan, no executive could ever again erase my name. That night, I pored over my savings. Margaret and I had been careful, living below our means, building a cushion. Add to that the early contracts from the manufacturers who had signed with me, and the balance was enough to make Henry's plan possible. Risky, yes, but risk has a different flavor when you've already been written off by men in expensive suits. Within 2 weeks, I had quietly purchased a stake, small at first, then larger as the price fell further. By August, word reached me through an analyst contact. "Walter, you're in the top 10 shareholders now. The board can't ignore you." It was almost laughable. The same board that had offered me hush money now had to send me meeting agendas. Trent must have choked when he saw my name on the shareholder roster. Sure enough, an invitation arrived. Quarterly board meeting. Attendance requested, Mr. Walter Grayson. No longer a retiree to be mocked, but a shareholder with rights. The meeting was held in the same high glass tower where they had once dismissed me. But this time, when I entered the boardroom, there was no condescension in the air, only wariness. The chairman's handshake was firm but cold. Trent wouldn't even meet my eyes at first. As the financial reports were read, I let them go through the motions, talking about headwinds and uncertain market sentiment. When the floor opened for comments, I rose slowly, placing Margaret's brass calipers on the table in front of me. "Gentlemen," I said, voice steady, 42 years ago I built the process that still keeps your lines running. You called me obsolete. Now I sit here as one of your largest shareholders. Respect is not optional anymore. It is owed." The silence that followed was thick. No one laughed. No one smirked. Even Trent stared at the table, jaw tight. The weight of truth had shifted, and they all knew it. After the meeting, Henry clapped me on the shoulder. "You realize what just happened, don't you? You're not just defending your name anymore. You're steering the ship." I looked out the glass window at the skyline. The city sprawled like a map of choices. "Then let's steer it somewhere honest." That night, back home, I wrote in my journal, August 18th. Today I sat at their table as an equal. No, more than equal. They forgot who laid the first stone. Now they'll remember every time they sign a report with my name beside theirs. The turning point has come. I closed the journal and looked at Margaret's picture. "We've come a long way from that cake," I whispered. And for the first time in months, I laughed. A laugh not of bitterness, but of triumph earned slowly, patiently, like steel forged in a furnace no one thought still burned. The next board meeting came quicker than I expected. Once word spread that I had become a significant shareholder, the calls began, not from executives this time, but from smaller board members, cautious voices asking if I intended to make trouble. I answered them with the same line each time. Not trouble. Truth. When I walked into the conference room that crisp September morning, the atmosphere was different. Last time they had tried to smother me with politeness. This time they watched me like a man might watch a live wire, aware of its power, wary of its spark. The chairman cleared his throat, his smile thin. "Mr. Grayson, thank you for joining us again. I understand you've raised certain concerns about leadership direction." I placed my folder on the table, the papers neatly stacked. Beside it, I laid Margaret's calipers once more, their brass gleaming in the sterile light. My voice carried steady. "Gentlemen, my concerns are simple. This company was built on craft and honesty. Those who lead it now have forgotten both. I'm here to remind you what keeps a machine running. Respect for the people who built it, and respect for the agreements that protect it." Trent Mallory shifted in his chair. His usual grin stretched too thin to hide the tightness around his mouth. "With respect, Walter," he said, "this is business. Nostalgia doesn't drive profits. Innovation does." I turned to him slowly, meeting his eyes across the table. Innovation doesn't mean theft. It doesn't mean plastering my process across glossy brochures while telling the man who created it that he's obsolete. And it certainly doesn't mean calling 40 years of loyalty a footnote. The room went still. One of the directors, a woman from Chicago who rarely spoke, cleared her throat. "He's right," she said quietly. "The headlines are killing us. Investors want accountability. We can't afford more arrogance." The chairman rubbed his temple, eyes heavy. "So what do you propose, Mr. Grayson?" I opened my folder, sliding across a single-page proposal. Recognition of the Grayson process in all corporate materials. Immediate back payment of withheld royalties, with penalties. A restructuring of leadership that holds executives accountable for this debacle. I let my eyes linger on Trent as I added, and a commitment to rebuild respect within the company, not just on the balance sheet, but on the shop floor, where the real work is done. Trent barked a laugh, but no one joined him. His cheeks flushed, and his hand tightened around his pen until it clicked. Another director spoke up. "He's not wrong. Morale is collapsing. We've lost contracts. If we keep pretending this isn't our fault, we'll lose the whole company." The silence that followed was its own verdict. The board had shifted. I could feel it. They weren't just tolerating me anymore. They were listening. When the meeting adjourned, Trent stalked out, his jaw set. I lingered a moment longer, watching the others shuffle their papers. One or two gave me small nods, as if to say they knew the tide had turned. Outside, Henry waited, leaning against the marble column of the lobby. "How'd it go?" he asked. I smiled faintly. They heard me, not because they wanted to, but because the truth left them no choice. That evening I sat on the porch with Linda. She had baked bread, the kind Margaret used to, and the scent carried me back years. "You're different," she said softly. "How so?" "You're not just angry anymore. You're leading. They mocked you, Walter, but now they're sitting at your table." I thought about that long after she left. She was right. For the first time since the retirement party, I didn't feel like a man defending himself. I felt like a man steering something larger than pride. Before bed, I wrote in my journal, September 22nd. Today they looked at me not as a relic, but as a reckoning. The faces that once laughed are now pale with worry. The table has turned, and I intend to keep it that way. I capped my pen, glanced at Margaret's photo, and whispered, "We're not finished yet." The announcement came on a Monday morning, printed in the kind of polished press release Harridan usually reserved for new product launches. Leadership realignment, commitment to integrity and innovation. That was the headline, but buried in the neat paragraphs was the truth. Trent Mallory had been reassigned. He was no longer vice president of operations. Effective immediately, he would transition into a role directly supporting strategic oversight, reporting to the board's newest shareholder representative, Mr. Walter Grayson. When I read the line, I sat very still at my kitchen table. The words had a weight I let settle in me slowly, like an old song rediscovered. They had mocked me with a cake. They had called me obsolete. And now the man who had smirked while my dignity was carved into frosting would sit across from me, required to listen. At the first restructuring meeting he arrived late, shoulders tight, eyes darting. Gone was the confident swagger, the polished grin. He looked like a man suddenly aware that his own reflection was thinner than he had believed. He mumbled a greeting, but I didn't return it. I began the meeting simply. Gentlemen, ladies, we are here to rebuild. Not just profits. Respect charts were shown, numbers reviewed, strategies proposed. But I kept circling back to the same point. The men and women on the floor need to believe this company remembers them. If they don't, none of this will last. Trent shifted in his seat, clearly itching to speak. Finally, he muttered, Respect doesn't drive quarterly earnings. I turned to him, slow and steady. Neither does arrogance. And last I checked, your arrogance lost us millions. The room went quiet. Some directors tried to hide smiles. For the first time, Trent looked smaller than the chair he occupied. After the meeting, as we gathered our papers, he lingered by the door. Enjoy this while it lasts, Walter, he said under his breath. The board won't keep you around forever. I paused, meeting his eyes with calm that came from years he couldn't understand. Maybe not, I said softly, but long enough for you to remember what respect tastes like. In the weeks that followed, I made changes quietly but firmly. I rehired 2 supervisors who had been pushed out during Trent's rise. I reinstated training programs that valued skill over speed. I even walked the Riverworks floor again, shaking hands, listening to the hum of the machines. When workers saw me there, whispers ran through the line. Grayson's back. The pride in their voices reminded me why I had started all this in the first place. And Trent? He attended every meeting, forced to present reports directly to me. Each time he tried to gloss over numbers, I cut in with questions too precise for him to dodge. Each time he bristled, I reminded him with silence that his seat was borrowed. One Friday evening, as the office emptied, I found myself alone in the boardroom, Margaret's calipers resting in my hand. The city lights glowed against the glass. I thought of that party months ago, of the humiliation, of the word obsolete iced across cheap cake. And then I thought of now, Trent scribbling notes while I set the agenda. I whispered into the quiet, Tables do turn, don't they, Margaret? The house that night felt lighter when I returned. I wrote in my journal, October 10th. They mocked me with laughter. Now they listen with silence. The table is mine, and those who called me useless now call me Sir. I closed the book, poured a glass of bourbon, and sat on the porch. Across the street, Linda waved as she watered her roses. I lifted my glass in a quiet salute. For the first time in many years, the evening air tasted not of resignation, but of victory. Slow, steady, earned. The leaves had begun to turn by the time the last of the restructuring took hold. Riverworks hummed with steadier rhythm now, the workers' steps less burdened, their laughter drifting back into the lunchroom corners where silence had once settled heavy. Harridan's stock, though still fragile, had begun to climb, and analysts credited the renewed commitment to legacy values. I didn't care for the jargon, but I knew what it meant. Respect had finally found its way back into the company's vocabulary. That Saturday, my daughter Claire drove down with her 2 boys. She hadn't been able to hide her worry these past months, worry that the fight would break me instead of lift me. When she walked into my kitchen and saw me standing taller, a folder of contracts neatly stacked on the counter, she smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. Dad, she said, pulling me into a hug. You look lighter. I am, I answered simply. I carried their disrespect for too long. Now they carry my name instead. That evening we sat on the porch, the grandsons tumbling in the yard, Linda joining us with a pie still warm. As the sun set, I brought out Margaret's photograph and set it on the table beside the brass calipers. Claire placed her hand gently on the frame. "She would be proud," she whispered. I poured 3 glasses of bourbon, one for me, one for Henry, who had stopped by after a late meeting, and one that sat quietly before Margaret's picture. The boys had cider, Linda a cup of tea. I lifted my glass slowly, letting the quiet stretch the way it always had in our home. "To dignity," I said, my voice steady. "To patience, to work that endures, and to names that cannot be erased." Henry raised his glass. "To a man who showed them legacy is leverage." Claire clinked hers gently against mine. "To a father who refused to stay silent." I took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through me not like fire, but like a hearth on a winter's night. The kind of warmth that steadies, that anchors, the kind that says a chapter has closed properly. Later, when the others had gone inside, I stayed on the porch, Margaret's picture before me. "They thought they buried me with a word," I told her softly. "They forgot I was the soil." The maples swayed in the evening breeze, their branches catching the last orange light of autumn. For the first time since that bitter day of humiliation, I felt not just vindicated, but whole. I opened my journal one last time and wrote, October 28th. Tonight we toasted not revenge, but respect. They called me obsolete. Now they call me the man who saved them. The table is mine. The story is done. I capped the pen, closed the book, and sat back with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had not only measured what mattered, but ensured it would never be forgotten. The cemetery was quiet that morning, the grass damp with autumn dew, the maple leaves scattered like rust across the paths. I carried no folder, no contract, no legal proof of anything, only Margaret's photograph, the brass calipers, and a small bouquet of asters she had always loved. I knelt by her headstone, running my fingers across the carved letters of her name. Time had softened the stone, but the memory of her voice was as sharp as the day I lost her. "We made it, Margaret," I whispered. "They mocked me once, tried to turn my life's work into a joke. But I stood, and now they stand under my name." The wind carried a faint rustle through the trees, as if the world were listening. I placed the calipers on the headstone, for a moment, letting the brass catch the morning light. Measure what matters. Those had been her words, her wisdom. And now, standing here, I understood them more than ever. It was never about money, never about titles. It was about dignity, and leaving behind a truth that could not be erased. I told her everything. The boardroom silence when I demanded respect. The look on Trent Mallory's face when he was forced to report to me. The way Claire's eyes shone when she realized her father had not been broken, but rebuilt. "We planted something," I said softly. "Not bitterness, not vengeance, roots. And now the roots are deeper than ever." As I stood, I felt no anger left in me, only a calm weight. Betrayal had been answered, humiliation overturned, respect restored. The revenge I had carried in my heart for months had transformed into something cleaner, justice. That evening I sat once more on the porch with Linda and Claire beside me, the grandsons playing tag in the yard. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in fire and gold. I raised a glass of water, plain, clear, and said, "To legacy, to family, to the truth that endures." Linda touched her glass to mine. "To Walter Grayson," she said softly, "the man who reminded them that age doesn't erase worth." The boys came running, their laughter carrying across the yard, and for a moment the air was full of the sound of everything I had fought for. Life, continuity, the simple respect of being seen. When the house grew quiet that night, I opened my journal for the last time on this matter and wrote, November 3rd. Legacy restored. Margaret's wisdom carried me through. The fight is over, and the name Grayson stands not as history, but as proof. They called me useless. Now they work for me. I close the journal, set the pen aside, and lean back in my chair. Outside, the maples stood tall against the darkening sky, their roots firm, their branches unbowed, and I knew as surely as I knew my own breath that my story was not one of endings, but of dignity reclaimed. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. And tell us, what city are you watching from?